Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders The Abomination Vault by Ari Marmel. I'm BurningDogFace, and last time we read Chapter 2, in which Death heard the testament of the spirit of Sarasael, the murdered angel, who claimed that his unit, the Thane Guard, were suddenly swarmed by murderous constructs. Then he got interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Let's see how things are going from there, shall we? Chapter 3. Get away from him, damn you! Death's head snapped around, hunting the source of that voice where no voice should sound. Sarasael's spirit, unshackled by the abrupt lapse in the Horseman's concentration, slipped away. The body fell limp once more, and Death could hear the faintest of relieved sighs fading away in an unreal direction that he knew but could not name. When a new angel appeared from between two trees where before there had been nothing but empty space, Death was already moving. Hanging in the angel's two-handed grip, a massive cannon of bronze tubing and iron slabs fired burst after burst. Fearsome energies ran wild, crackling and spitting, reducing whole trees to ash. Fragments of blessed metals embedded themselves in the earth, punched holes entirely through the thickest trunks, and the forest trembled with the sound of thunder. And none of it touched the Horseman. He was simply never there, and the projectiles soared past, never in the radius, and they ignited. He moved with a grace the lithest angel couldn't have matched, guided by an insight that bordered on the precognitive. He swayed from, rolled under, or tumbled over anything that came near, seemed almost to walk up the side of trees, and even change direction mid-leap. The rage that marred the angel's face twisted his features further still. His body shook with such anger that it began to affect the cannon's aim, and the weapon spat as swiftly as he could physically pull the trigger. Still he missed, every time, and he'd have been infinitely more frustrated had he known that his unyielding barrage didn't even warrant Death's full attention. Where in the name of oblivion had he come from? Almost nobody should have been able to sneak so close without Death sensing their presence. Certainly not an angel in heavy, clanking armor, lugging heavy artillery. It was right about the time the second angel appeared, opening fire from high above, this one armed with a rune-encrusted halberd that spat volleys of force so fearsome the blade itself seemed little more than an afterthought, that the Horseman pinpointed what else was wrong with his surroundings. The dead Sarasael had described a vast barrage of devastating energies and explosions, tearing down entire thickets. So where was all the damage? Why were the only obvious gaps in the foliage and fallen trees the results of the firepower he currently dodged? Death twisted aside, letting the hail of bullets sweep past him, but avoiding two separate attackers was proving far more difficult than one alone. "I don't suppose we can discuss this?" he asked without much hope. In response, a third angel, wielding a halberd much like the soldier above, stepped from inside a tree trunk, or so it appeared anyway, and took aim. "On your heads be it, then." Death dropped into an impossibly low crouch, right knee bent, left leg extended out beside him, bent so sharply forward at the waist that his dangling hair brushed the soil. And in that instant, when every one of the angel's shots arced overhead, before they could even think to adjust their aim, Harvester ripped itself loose from the soil. The Horseman leapt, impossibly high, as swiftly as if he himself boasted a pair of the angel's feathered wings. The scythe met him at the apex of his flight. And then he was falling, twisting in the air beneath and around the soldier's constant fire. He spread his arms and held not one single weapon any longer, but a pair of scythes. neither nearly as long of haft as Harvester's unified form, but each with a blade nearly as massive. He hit the earth, feet embedding themselves in the soil, and both scythes spun. Behind his back, one of them deflected a burst of cannon fire, slinging it high into the canopy above. He hadn't even turned to look. Before him, the other scythe made 3 complete revolutions. The first sliced the angel's halberd in half. The second removed both arms at the elbows, and the third cleaved him cleanly from right hip to left shoulder. Death had come around to face the remaining pair before the top half of the body slid completely free of the lower. An angel shrieked. Death couldn't tell and didn't care which one, and both took to the air. They soared straight up, parallel to the trunks, wings snapping branches and showering the horsemen with leaves and twigs. The barrels of both weapons turned inexorably downward, ready to add far deadlier precipitation to this deluge. Death hurled the scythe from his left hand. It spun up and out, severing the branches in its path. The cannoneer easily swooped aside, dodging the swift but apparently clumsy attack. He snickered, tightened his grip on the trigger, and fell, grunting in pain, as a particularly thick branch, Death's true target, plummeted from above and slammed him back to earth. The scythe followed, retracing its arc and returning to its master. The half-instant in which the other angel was distracted by his brother's fall was more than long enough for Death to dart aside and duck low, vanishing into the thicket of brambles. He watched, peering between the thorns, as the angel's eyes and weapon tracked this way and that, seeking a target. Then, when he found no obvious sign of the foe, the soldier dropped to check on his injured companion. Just as the angel's boots touched down, Death lunged from the thorns. When he began the thrust, it was with one of the twin scythes. By the time the blade struck home, he held only one weapon. Harvester had become a long-hafted, broad-bladed spear. The angel coughed once, and died by the time the sound had faded. Death yanked back on the spear, only it was no longer a spear, but a scythe once more. The crescent edge sliced through the upper curve of the last angel's wing, just as he was heaving the branch off his back. He cried out, dropping to his knees. Not a lethal wound by any means, but he wouldn't be flying any time soon. "Now can we discuss this?" Death asked politely. "You bastard!" The epithet squeezed through gritted teeth, carried on a spray of enraged spittle. "You just killed 2 of my brothers!" "You did attack me first, remember? Then, I wouldn't recommend it. You're not nearly fast enough." The angel jerked back, tearing his eyes away from the cannon lying just out of reach. He huddled down on his knees, fists clenched, his wounded wing drooping. "You were defiling Sarasael's body. I couldn't allow that." "Defiling? I was only asking him a few questions." "Necromancy," the angel spat. "Defilement enough. And how am I to know you aren't responsible for the attack on us in the first place?" Death actually blinked. "If I were responsible, why in creation would I be questioning the dead about what happened?" "It could be a trick," the angel muttered, his tone obstinate beneath the overt pain. "A trick? To fool observing angels that I couldn't even see were here? Apparently you think me so cunning that I even outsmarted logic and sense. Maybe, is there someone in command I can speak to? Someone with a brain, if that's not asking too much?" "No, I'm alone." Death shook his head. "Stupid and a bad liar. Your canon was actually the thinker in the partnership, wasn't it?" Then, before the angel could retort, Death turned his face to the canopy and raised his voice. "I know you're out there. I know you've hidden yourself. I know what I see isn't real." That was, after all, the only possible explanation for how the angels had mysteriously appeared, and why the woods showed so little sign of damage. The Horseman was actually impressed. The illusion had to be a potent magic indeed to have worked on him. For long moments, nothing happened. No one answered. And then the entire forest rippled. Enormous gaps appeared in the trees, swaths of devastation where the soil was melted into solid rock and no living things remained. Twisting helixes of smoke wrestled their way upward, each struggling to be the first to reach the lowering clouds. Flurries of cinders still hovered above the empty places, and death was suddenly struck by the thick aroma of burnt wood and seared flesh. A very powerful magic, then. More of the White City's soldiers appeared as the phantasmal image retracted, some standing, some hovering on slowly flapping wings. Most bore deep scores in their armor and dried blood on their flesh. All carried weapons of lethal design, and none looked anything less than enraged. "Don't be foolish," Death told them. "I'm not the enemy here. Not yet." "And how many of us would you have killed if you were the enemy?" Death glanced up at the one who spoke. The angel descending to land before him was unlike the others. The same pale hair, yes, the same white eyes. He wore no armor, however, and carried no obvious weapon. His ornate robe, an emerald green, with trim and all manner of avian designs in gold, was so long it dragged in the dirt, while its wearer yet drifted a spear length above. A semicircle of gold, also engraved and sculpted into winged patterns, formed an arch over his head. Death bowed his own head in respect, a shallow gesture, to be sure, but one he would have offered to few others in creation. "Azrael," he said in greeting, thinking, if Abaddon managed to drag him away from his libraries and the Well of Souls, this must be even worse than the Council suspected. "Death," the angel replied. "Your soldiers attacked me, Azrael, not the other way around. And in answer to your question, all of you." "I suppose you might have tried at that." The angel touched down a few paces from the horseman. His robes, despite their previous length, now hung only to the ankles of his supple boots. "Fortunate for you that we were some distance away when this little skirmish began. Had we reached you while you were still in battle, I doubt I could have prevented my friends here from attacking you instantly." "Someone was fortunate anyway," Death retorted. "You're welcome to believe it was me if that makes you feel better." He gestured vaguely in the direction from which the soldiers of the White City had appeared. "Your work?" "Of course. The sorceries I've mastered in my millennia would surprise even the Charred Council's vaunted writers." "If such a time should come, Creator forbid, that I should have need to surprise you. I've never heard of angels hiding behind figments and phantasms before." The glowers of the soldiers grew even fiercer. Some, the wounded angel included, looked as though they wanted to cast their weapons aside and have at Death with teeth and nails. More like demons than angels, he couldn't help but think. But even he was not so uncouth, or so foolish, as to voice such an observation. Azrael, however, only shrugged. "We have many wounded, Death. Our strength is not what it should be, and we have no means of determining if the enemy plans to return. It made sense to seize whatever tactical advantage we could and protect our brethren in every way possible. No need to be defensive. I applaud the initiative." He cast his burning gaze across each angel, slowly, calmly. "If we've concluded our efforts to slaughter each other, Azrael, we ought to discuss what comes next." One snowy eyebrow rose at that. "But you've yet to answer our question, Horseman." Death thought back a moment. "Azrael, you don't honestly believe this attack was my doing?" "It could have been," the angel said patiently. "The motives of the Council are inscrutable at best." Had I sought your blood, I'd have attacked you myself. Perhaps I might have had one or more of my brothers at my side, but I do not make use of minions. Your masters might, though, yes? As I'm here at their behest, if they're responsible for this, I'll be as surprised as you are, and substantially more confused. Azrael's lip twitched. All right, come, Death, we'll consult with Abaddon and decide our next move. Yes, I assumed he'd survived, if anyone had. The abrupt stiffness in Azrael's face gave him pause. Something I should know? Abaddon survived, but not unscathed. Come, perhaps you'll know something of his affliction our healers do not. Show me. Surrounded by twin columns of angels, they marched from the copses of trees through blasted clearings, smoldering wounds in the primeval woodland, then deeper into the forest once more. None of the angels seemed remotely as comfortable with Death's presence as Azrael did. Death, for his part, would have had to actually be sleeping to care any less how they felt. A soft flutter overhead heralded Dust's reappearance, settling to perch on the dull outer curve of Harvester's blade. Interesting, Azrael observed. Not really. Crows are very poor conversationalists. A good thing you've never had any interesting conversation, then. Death glanced sidelong at Azrael's expression, but it had remained impassive. He honestly couldn't tell if the angel had meant that in jest or not. A few moments more of leaves and sticks crunching under the warrior's heavy tread, a constant popping as though the forest itself were an arthritic grandparent, and the procession came across the first of the shattered stone soldiers. They could have stopped to allow a closer examination, but a glance told Death enough for now. He could not quite agree with Sarasael's description. It seemed to him less like a canine with a humanoid torso, and more like a blocky insect, rearing up so that its front legs might rend and grab. Everything else was as the departed soul had portrayed, the graven runes, the carapace of rock, and the utter lack of any unnecessary features, such as, for instance, a head. Solid stone all the way through, Azrael said without looking around. And the others, the stone and brass soldiers? Largely hollow, save for some rods providing the outer surface with extra structural support. Part of why they could move so swiftly, I suppose. Death allowed himself a few paces to reflect. Then, I'm not familiar with either design, he admitted. If I've ever seen them before, I don't recall it. Nor were any of us, Azrael told him, which means we have no idea who attacked us. Constructs usually mean a maker, but plenty of others have hired, purchased, or even usurped mastery of constructs before, Death concluded, meaning that for all your deliberations and all the soldiers you lost, you have nothing of any substance. Your tact, as always, is overwhelmingly appreciated. Death chose to let that lie. The next length of their journey passed without conversation, save for the occasionally resentful murmur of angels who would much rather be soaring back to their camp than trudging over the dirt like lesser beings. Any spiteful satisfaction Death might have gained from their discomfort vanished utterly, however, beneath a tide of agony that flowed from up ahead. It wasn't his pain. He wasn't suffering in any way. But he was aware of the torment of others, the anguish of creatures unaccustomed to such things. It was rather like the tang of rain in the air, or that first gust of wind announcing the coming of winter, sensed by the spirit rather than the body. And he felt, too, the recent passing of so very many souls. Our camp, Azrael announced with just a hint of bitterness. How primitive, Death said blandly. The so-called camp boasted a surrounding rampart of ivory white stone, some 20 paces in height and easily 3 times that lengthwise on each side. A portcullis of gleaming silver, its bars serrated into thousands of barbed fangs, provided the only means of entry for earthbound creatures. At each of the 4 corners, a spindly tower loomed nearly as high above the battlements as the battlements rose above the soil. And atop each tower, a double-barreled siege cannon, some 4 times the size of the portable weapons Death had so recently faced. "Imagine," the Horseman continued, "what you could have accomplished with actual time and resources." Azrael nodded grimly, apparently oblivious, or perhaps simply naturally immune, to Death's sarcasm. "Sadly lacking, I know, still the best we could manage, given the circumstances." The twin columns of angels, along with their guest, approached the lustrous gate at a casual pace. The nearest cannons tracked their every move, swiveling at seemingly impossible angles to maintain a line of fire even as they stood by the wall itself. The portcullis didn't rise to allow ingress. Rather, it faded almost completely from sight, leaving only a wavering mirage in its place. As best Death could describe the sensation of passing through those phantom bars, it felt like stepping through a waterfall without the getting wet part. Only when they'd passed through the battlements did the cannons return their aim towards the surrounding woods and the horizons beyond. Within the fortifications, a perfectly geometrical array of smaller structures glinted orange in the sunlight. Each was constructed of an amber-hued glass, just opaque enough to allow privacy to anyone within. Death knew, without the need for close examination, that the substance would be as strong as stone or steel, despite its crystalline appearance. Not due to any special senses on his part, but simply because he knew that angels in the field would accept nothing weaker. In neat rows between the buildings, bloodied soldiers lay on stiff cots, recovering from their injuries. More angels dashed around them, tending the wounded with medicinal balms, both alchemical and mystical. They did their best. Their faces had gone slack with exhaustion and effort, but they were so few, and their patients many. Blotches of blood and scattered feathers were more abundant on the grass than fallen leaves. The accompanying angels peeled off to return to their own cots or to seek treatment for their injuries, many glaring at Death as they departed. Azrael alone remained to lead the Horsemen to the one structure that stood in the perfect center of the encampment. Of course. No doors marred the perfect crystal surface. As with the portcullis, a section of the wall simply phased away, allowing the angel and the rider to enter. "What is that doing here?" The voice was gruff, powerful, clearly accustomed to instant and unquestioning obedience, but it also quavered ever so slightly with repressed agony. "A pleasure, Lord Abaddon," Death replied. The greatest warrior the White City had ever produced sat upon a chair of ivory-hued hardwood, gripping it so tightly that the armrests had cracked. Shoulders and chest seemingly large enough to uproot a small mountain were encased in gold-trimmed armor so heavy that most angels couldn't have lifted it, let alone worn it. The square jaw, framed by an unkempt mass of the angel's traditional platinum hair, was distended in a furious scowl that seemed quite capable of chewing through the defensive walls. A pair of angels stood, one to either side of the great general, tending his injuries. With balm-soaked cloths and foul-smelling unguents, they prodded, ever careful, ever gentle, at their commander's face. And it was indeed that face that drew Death's attention. Vicious gouges marred the flesh from forehead to cheek on both sides, and a crimson-soaked bandage completely hid the angel's right eye. Or, to judge by the concave flecks of the blood-stiffened fabric, the empty socket that had once housed the eye. That Abaddon was conscious, let alone functional and rational, was enough to impress even the impassive Horseman. Azrael stepped between them, speaking softly but swiftly. A few emphatic gestures, a few barked questions, and Abaddon grudgingly nodded. "All right, Horseman. Azrael's convinced me we're on the same side of this, for now. How magnanimous of you." The general grumbled, low in his throat. "Tell me what you know." "Less than you do," Death said. "I know of the attack, up to the appearance of the brass warriors. Beyond that—" He shrugged. "There's little to tell beyond that," Abaddon said. "They gave us some trouble, and I lost some good soldiers, but we rebuffed them." "Did you?" Death asked him. "Are you certain?" Abaddon's glower returned, stiffer even than before. "We did," Azrael said, stepping in. "I know what you're asking, Death, and I can assure you the garden was not breached." "I'll need to see for myself. Once I've returned, we can—" "No," Abaddon growled. While at the same time Azrael said, "The way is barred." "Then unbar it." "I'm sorry," Azrael told him, and it sounded as though he genuinely meant that. "I understand how important this is to you." "You cannot possibly—" "But we cannot risk it. The enemy may still be watching. To lower the defenses, even for a moment, might grant them the opportunity they require. I won't do so, not even for you." "I know my way to the gate," Death said, his voice dangerously calm. Only the blazing fire in his eyes, stoked brighter than Azrael had ever seen it, suggested the growing fury within. "Do you believe your wards can keep me out indefinitely if I choose to break them?" "Not indefinitely," the scholarly angel said softly, "but long. Long enough for our common enemy, whoever he may be, to move to whatever the next stage of whatever plan he's following." "And you'd be fending off the forces of the White City at every moment," Abaddon said, "after having had to kill every one of us present just to begin. Myself included," Azrael added. Death's mask couldn't hide his scowl. You've never been a warrior, Azrael." "Neither am I remotely helpless on the battlefield, as you well know. Would you really pit yourself against all of heaven merely to confirm with your own eyes what I swear to you is true, when I've no reason to deceive you?" The general's two attendants fell back, seemingly pushed away by an almost palpable clash of wills. Three of the most potent beings in creation watched one another, each considering what the other might say next, do next. Azrael looked almost to be holding his breath. Abaddon, with his remaining eye, measuring the distance to the impossibly gargantuan sword standing upright in the corner. And Death finally shook his head. Azrael had too much control to sigh in relief, but everyone sensed it all the same. "Know this, though," the Horseman said. "If I find you were wrong, if I find that Eden was breached and the remains of my brethren have been disturbed in any way, not all the blades in heaven will keep me from you." "Understood." Death turned away, staring at the amber wall as he struggled to swim against the rushing tide of anger. Only when he was certain that he'd regained all control did he look back at the angels. "So what now?" "We need to decide that," Abaddon said. The Horseman chose to ignore the fact that the general's gaze continued to flicker between Death himself and that sword. "Can you—" Clearly he had no desire to say what he was about to say. "Can you ask one of them who sent them?" "No. Some constructs have souls like any other creature. Lesser automatons have life, but no true soul. These are the latter. There's nothing for me to call back and question." "Then," Abaddon said, "until we can determine who attacked us, I don't see much we can do." His lips twisted in a rictus grin. bitter, self-mocking, and utterly without humor. But then, I'm not seeing as well as I used to, am I? All the miracles of angelic medicine I've heard about aren't enough? Death asked. Surely regrowing a lost eye isn't beyond your healer's skills. Normally, no, Azrael said. He glanced briefly at Abaddon, who nodded once reluctantly. But in this instance it's not to be. Something about the weapon that struck Lord Abaddon was horribly unnatural. The wounds it dealt turned instantly necrotic. Our healers and the General's own strength have kept the rot and poison from spreading, but I fear the wounds themselves are beyond even our... death? What is it? The horseman's body had gone rigid as any tombstone. The skin on his knuckles threatened to tear. "This weapon," he whispered, barely more than a breath. The others had to lean in to make out the words. Was this the sword that one of the brass-armored constructs carried? Then, at Abaddon's grunt and Azrael's nod, "Do you have it?" "No," the general told him sourly. "The construct that carried it was one of those that retreated when it became clear they could not win past us. A narrow-bladed sword, nearly as long as I am tall, but scarcely 3 fingers wide at the blade. Serpentine filigree running up the center of the blade." Both angels stared openly now. "What do you know?" Abaddon demanded. Again, Death turned away, apparently scrutinizing some unseen image, or some half-faded memory, hovering between him and that wall. Finally, just as Abaddon was drawing breath to speak again, Death said, "We are allies in this? I can trust you to keep me apprised of anything you discover?" "Assuming you are equally forthcoming with us, of course," Azrael said. The general glowered at him, shifting uncomfortably in his creaking chair, but made no overt protest. "Affliction." Still, Death kept his back turned, as though concerned, despite the mask, that they might read something untoward in his visage. "The name of the sword is Affliction." "Descriptive enough," Abaddon said flatly, "but how do you know of it?" "Because it's a Nephilim weapon." Finally, the horseman turned towards them, raising his scythe for emphasis. "Taken from the Makers, and imbued with our power at roughly the same time as Harvester." "I see." Abaddon's sneer had deepened, his single eye narrowed sharply enough to cut, and Azrael didn't seem much happier. "And who wields it now, Horseman? One of you?" No, Abaddon, that's the problem. Affliction was lost ages ago, on the fields of Kothysos." "Kothysos? I don't believe I know of that one." Once it became clear that Death wasn't planning to elaborate, Azrael spoke up. "There's little written of it even in the library of the Argent Spire. We know it occurred during the height of the Nephilim rampage across the many realms. Several races of the Old Ones, concerned that they could not defend themselves if the Horde turned their way, hired an enormous army of mercenary demons to crush the Nephilim. They met on the fields of Kothysos. Death's people won that engagement, but at a high cost. If I'm not mistaken, Kothysos represents the largest single loss of Nephilim life before Eden." "The corpses were stacked in mountains," Death said, his mind clearly elsewhere. "The Nephilim. This is after the other horsemen and I turned from them, just in case either of you planned to waste time accusing me. Scoured the battlefield, recovering the dead and what weapons they could. But much was lost, either destroyed or buried so deep in the carnage and churned earth that it was thought gone forever." "Obviously not," Abaddon snapped. "Yes, obviously." "So someone found a Nephilim artifact in Kothysos," Azrael said. "Troublesome, but is it truly so disastrous? It's just a sword, albeit a potent one." "Affliction," Death said, his voice grimmer even than usual, "was not the only thing lost in that battle. He whistled, a high sound that the others in the room could only barely hear. From outside, a small commotion erupted amongst the angels as despair materialized in a sickly cloud, having stepped through the void so that he might appear once more at his master's side. "I have to go! I have to see!" "Wait." Abaddon rose shakily to his feet as the horseman strode towards the phantom spot in the wall. "You agreed to share what you knew!" Death looked back over his shoulder. "I don't know. I suspect. If I'm wrong, my suspicions don't matter. If I'm right, I'll inform you then." He passed through the wall and hauled himself into the ragged saddle. "Pray to your Creator for the former." The green mist billowed once more, and the horseman was gone. Well, that brings us to the end of Chapter 3. We're learning some really interesting and tantalizing bits of information now, just parceled out piece by piece. But we are still a long way from fully understanding what's going on here. I'm BurningDogFace, and I will see you on the next episode of Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault, when we leave Death to follow his own path for a while and check in on his younger brother. In Chapter 4, we head to the land of the Charred Council and find out what war is doing in their domain. I'll see you then, Burning Dog fans. Later!